So for those who might not know me, I'm Barry Stahl. I'm a solution architect and developer right here in Tempe, Carvana. And I've been doing this about 35 years now. I've spent about 23 years of my career at what are now large companies, American Airlines and Intel. And the rest of it scattered about different smaller companies, government agencies, things like that. So I've had a pretty wide experience in the field. And I've been using Agile methodologies. The development teams I've been involved with have been using Agile methodologies pretty much since the original Kent Beck White Book, which came out in '99. I'd say roughly 2000 is about where I really first started using Agile development methodologies. So I've seen it working well. I've seen it working slightly less well. But that's really what I do. Who I am is a little bit different. I'm the kind of person who keeps a list of favorite physicists and favorite mathematicians. So that probably tells you all you really need to know about me. Also love to talk about such a list, so I tweeted it. BS Stahl is my Twitter, and it's the pinned tweet on there. So feel free to go on Twitter and tell me where I screwed up, who's on the list, or who did I miss, or what have you. I'm also an open source contributor. I have a number of projects that I shepherd. None of them are really directly appropriate here, but so I'm not going to go through them, but this list will be on the slide deck, which is already online and available. The link will be at the end. You'll be able to pull it down and look and see if any of these projects are interesting to you, or if any of you or your development teams want to contribute to any of them. And I'm also one of the founders of Arizona Give Camp. If you're not familiar with the Give Camp, it's a weekend event where we put a bunch of software creators, that's developers, designers, project managers, testers, et cetera. We put them all in a room with a bunch of local charities, ideally ones that really can't afford their own IT services. And then we code for the weekend on the for those charities, turn over the code at the end of the weekend. Our 10th event is coming up this March. We haven't announced the exact weekend yet, but please sign up at meetup.com/azgivecamp and you'll be notified as soon as we arrange that event. All right, so now's where I get to give the warning. I'm going to say things that you're going to disagree with. At least I hope so. That's okay. What I would encourage is the things that you most disagree with, spend the most time thinking about. Is it possible that you've been thinking about it, or there's a different way to think about the way we've been doing things? And the other thing I would point out here is that I've been doing this a long time. I've seen a lot of different things. If you think you know where I saw this one particular thing, you're probably wrong. I've seen a lot of different things, and I've seen a lot of things in a lot of different places. So there is no one specific thing I'm talking about when it comes to any of these examples I'm giving, unless I tell you there. All right, so let's start off with one easy thing. And then I think we can all agree on this. And that is, managing for the short term is detrimental to the company. We need to be thinking about how we manage our development teams, our development projects for the long term. Because the goals, I think, are pretty much always the same. It's how can we increase user value while minimizing total cost of ownership. The total cost of ownership especially is a very long-term goal. I mean, it includes things like decommissioning costs. So we need to be thinking about it over the life cycle point of view.
Yeah. Hey, Jace, can you please put yourself on mute? I think there's some background noise coming from your side. Thank you.
Although it is good practice for me to, deal with the distractions.
Oh, we don't like it either, so.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, we need to think about our projects and our development teams for the long term, because that's what's going to be to the most benefit of our companies. All right. So knowing that, with those as the goals, keeping that in mind, we're going to talk about three things today: Agile metrics, ceremonies, and tools and technologies. So let's start off right off the bat with metrics. And let's jump into some of those hard truths we were talking about. Here's one hard truth. Velocity metrics are not for you. They're not for us. They're not for team leadership. They're for the developers. And when I say developers in this case, I mean basically the individual contributors, the development teams, the testers, the developers, the designers, etc. Velocity metrics are for them, not for us. Why is that? Well, let's think about it in terms of how we calculate velocity. There's really two ways that velocity can be calculated. It can be calculated based on user value, which is really the most agile way of doing it, right? That's the product perspective. That's basing it on how much value do we actually provide to the end users. And I think this is really the way that the creators of the Agile Manifesto, this is what they had in mind. But I think most development teams, or at least most of the development teams that I've been involved with, do their pointing based on complexity. What is the complexity of this story versus other stories? And it's, of course, all relative. So which of those things translates to time?
Complexity more so translates to time.
Hopefully complexity has some correlation with time. Yes. But neither one of them directly relates to it, and that's really for a number of reasons. Story points do not equate to time. Let's think about these three items in the backlog. How well can you see that? Can that be read? All right. So we've got three items in the backlog here. Notify the fulfillment system of a new order, notify the purchasing system of a new order, and notify the data science team of a new order. All three are pretty similar stories, and if we thought about it from a complexity level, we'll probably give them the same number of points. But they may not take even close to the same amount of time for a number of reasons. First off, whichever one we do first, that's generally going to take longer because we're going to be building on top of that later on. We also have different implementers, maybe, unless we're always going to keep those stories and we're going to fix them to a specific person, which is not generally a good idea because then we get tribal knowledge. We have different levels of ignorance, right? Sometimes we'll get second order ignorance, so we don't know what we don't know. And of course, we'll talk a lot more about technical debt later, but different areas of the system may have different amounts of technical debt. So even stories that are very, very similar could take very, very different amounts of time to complete. So what are they good for then? If we can't use them to predict how long our project's going to take, what good are they? Well, really, they're good for two things. They're good for figuring out roughly how many points we may complete in the next iteration. So based on how our project is today, what is the state of our project today, and what is the state of our development team today, at this moment, we may be able to make some short-term prediction about how long we're going to take. If we've been getting, over the last 2 or 3 sprints, 20 story points worth of value created or complexity accomplished, then maybe we have a guide that says maybe we should take somewhere around 20 into the next sprint. The other thing is that it can be a warning to the team that something is wrong. Agile itself is all about surfacing problems. It's about trying to identify problems quickly. So if we see a real variation in the number of story points we're getting, or if we're not getting a nice curve, for the same reason earlier that I mentioned that we build on top of earlier stories, that means generally over time our velocity is going to increase. So what I expect to see generally, and this is always going to vary, but I always expect to see some level of increase in velocity as we get further and further into the project. If we're not seeing that, then maybe there's something wrong and we need to try and figure out what that is. Now here's a warning sign. I always watch for this. If I'm hearing in a retrospective, well, why aren't we getting as much work done as we should? And we're hearing things like, we need to get better at estimating our work. That is a danger sign. That tells me that there's a problem, for one, but it tells me there's one of two other things wrong here. There's one or two other situations. either the development team doesn't know why there's a problem, doesn't know what the cause of the problem is, and then we have to go in and figure out what it is, and there's some work there. Or the worst case scenario, they know what it is and they don't want to tell us. That's a bad situation. Regardless, if we're trying to take stories and velocity and turn that into time and use that to make predictions about when we're going to be able to finish the project or when something should be done, we're breaching the trust of the development team. We're putting things on them that don't make any sense. We're violating their trust, and that's going to come back to haunt us, and we'll talk more about that as we go forward. So, velocity metrics are not for us. Test coverage metrics are also not for us. Some of you have heard me rail about this a little bit. Test coverage, well, if you're trying to measure the development team on test coverage, this is you. You are stealing the development team's tools. What do I mean by that? Are you familiar with Goodhart's law? So Goodhart's law basically says that, once you measure something, it's no longer useful as a target. You can't say, we're going to measure this and we're going to try and track to this, because it then becomes useless. The apocryphal example is the Russian nail factory, where they said, okay, we're going to measure how many nails you create. And they say, great. We will create, you like how, yeah. We're going to create lots of tiny little nails, and we'll make lots of them. And they said, well, all right, sir, we can't do that. So we're going to measure you on the volume, on the weight of all the total nails you make. They say, yeah, so now I'm making huge nails. My Russian.
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. All right, cool. I don't really like these stories because it sounds like people are gaming the system. And in those examples, they probably are. But the fact is, they're doing what we told them to do. We told them to create a lot of nails or a lot of weight of nails. With test coverage, what we're telling them is to create a lot of coverage. But is coverage the goal of unit tests? Does coverage create quality? No, absolutely not. The important thing about unit tests is that they give us the confidence to refactor ruthlessly. That means I have to be able to, as a developer, go into a code base and be able to say, I am comfortable enough in this area of the code base to know that if I break something in here, my tests are going to show it. And that's how we end up not having legacy code, because we can go in and refactor things and make it so it's good code and it's doing what we need it to do. And it makes it maintainable and extensible and all the abilities that we value so much. Unit test coverage does not give us the confidence to refactor ruthlessly. In fact, measuring it takes that away because it hides it. When I'm going through a code base, one of the things I do is I look at code coverage, but I don't look at the number. I don't care what the number is. What I look at is, where does it show up red in the code? Where is it showing me that there is no coverage? Because that's a quick indicator that, okay, here's a place where I can write some tests and it might be valuable. Or I know that if I need to modify that area, I better go in and write a bunch of tests beforehand. But if we've just gone and said, you know what, we're going to value coverage. What are developers going to do? They're going to do what we ask them to do, which is that first test usually creates about 80% coverage. You could do any test, almost a null, a basic nothing test that provides virtually no value, and you'll get roughly 80% coverage. The real value comes in testing the different use cases. That's where I'm going to know if something is broken. But I'm not going to go and add use cases if you're telling me I'm judging you on test coverage. I'm going to go somewhere else and get another 80% in that area and another 80% in another area. And this is what ends up happening. I talked about that on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, by the way. So if you want to drill more into that, you can see it. This is what happens when we value test coverage over actual test cases. If we had 80% test coverage, we could have 80, 90% test coverage here, and it would still pass because I could test with no cars on that lift, and it's going to work perfectly. I can test with one car inside, and it's going to work perfectly. I can test with a low-profile car on top, and either 0 or 1 car is inside, and it's going to work perfectly. It's only when I hit those edge cases, or those corner cases, where I have a high-profile car up top, where these tests are going to fail. And that's where the value in unit testing comes in. So don't steal your development team's tools by trying to measure test coverage. That would be, of course, a breach of trust. So we've talked about metrics. We've said velocity metrics are not for us. Test coverage metrics are not for us. What is for us as development team leadership? Technical debt. We own that. Technical debt is, of course, shortcuts now that have to be paid back. And they really do translate to dollars. It is a real, I like the technical debt metaphor. I like thinking about it the same as financial debt, because you are borrowing against the future. And those shortcuts can lead to some real problems in our code bases. They lead to legacy code because lack of supportability, lack of maintainability, et cetera. And this is the work environment. This is where our development teams are spending their time. So if it's a frustrating work environment because of these things, of the lack of supportability and maintainability, if it's a slow environment and it's hard to go in and do all that work, we're going to frustrate our teams. Failure to manage it and manage technical debt and manage it well, it increases the total cost of ownership, not even over the real long term, it's actually even over a fairly short term, but it also creates a bad environment for our developers. And it is real money. It's real dollars. It translates very quickly into real dollars. So, you've been there, huh? To be very judicious about taking it on. I'm not saying never take on technical debt. Like financial debt, there are times where it's very appropriate to take it on. Just take it knowingly, be judicious about it, and like financial debt, have a plan to pay it back. Oh, and communicate those schedules. If a development team knows that they're going to have an opportunity to pay technical debt back, that can really help make things easier. It can help build trust. And of course, not doing so. You seeing the pattern here? Bit of a breach of trust. All right. So what do we want to take away from this metrics section of our program? Metrics are for the development teams to help themselves get better. They are not for us to use to judge the team. So be very, very careful how we use velocity and test coverage. And be very diligent with the technical debt. I would really love to find a way to not only measure technical debt well, but to charge it back to previous project managers. There's nothing worse in my mind that someone comes in and says, all right, we just need to get this done. Let's get this done and get it out, and everyone busts their butt and they build it and they create a bunch of technical debt, and then that person bungees off to do the next thing and screw up the next code base, and someone else comes in and has to deal with that debt. I think that debt should be able to be charged back to the person who created it. So, all right, soapbox done for this very second. Then we'll start another one here in a minute. All right, so let's move on to ceremonies. When and why do we use Agile ceremonies? Right? When somebody says Scrum, we'll jump in. All right, so something that's not for us as leadership, stand-up meetings. Stand-up meetings are about the development team making commitments to each other and keeping those commitments. So you all know the 3 questions, right? What did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? What are my roadblocks? The only thing that we should ever be talking about in the stand-up meeting as non-developers, non-individual contributors, is those roadblocks. Another purpose of the stand-up is about exposing problems. We talked about how Agile is about quickly surfacing problems so we can find them. If we see that there's one or more people who have been working on a particular problem for a couple of sprints or a couple of days, a couple of stand-ups, that surfaces a problem there, and maybe that's where we need to be able to say, all right, well, let's get someone pairing on that, or let's do some mob programming on that, or whatever is an appropriate way of attacking the problem. We're going to surface that problem as quickly as we can. The stand-ups are definitely not about gathering intel for status reports. It's not a status meeting. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't take notes in there and so they know what the status is. But the goal of the meeting is not to communicate status. And if we're making it about communicating status, that's a problem. Personally, I have a problem not making it about architecture. I am an architect, and what I want to make all the meetings about is, hey, let's architect that thing. And I need to stay out of that too. So I do what I can. I often fail. It's a hard problem. But of course, that would be me breaching the trust of the development team. So I'm not going to do that as much as I can. Another thing that's not for us is iteration planning meetings. This one I usually get some raised eyebrows on when I talk about it.
What's iteration planning?
That's, the sprint planning when we...
Oh, okay, sorry, thank you.
Iteration equals sprint. It's just a more generic term.
I was,
Thank you. Can I pass?
yes.
Okay. So our planning meetings are about understanding the stories. That's what we need to get out of those planning meetings. We need to make sure that we understand them and that we understand if there's any hidden complexity to them. I've seen this story. That's really what we need to get out of those planning meetings. We have to, the point of a story, right, is to be a placeholder for a conversation. Many of you have heard me use that term. It's a placeholder for a conversation. We need to make sure that there's enough information in the story that we can have that conversation, that we'll all know what we're talking about when we do have that conversation. We know who to talk to about that conversation and what the expected results of the story are, so that we're all on the same page for that conversation. Which often means that we're going to need to do things like more exploration. We're going to need to do more research. If there's not enough information in there, we need to be able to take the time to do that research. And so if we end up trying to stuff those stories into the sprint anyways, if we try to say, you know what, this story really isn't ready, but we just need to get it in the sprint and get it done. Or, yeah, I know everybody's already fully loaded, but we need to cram this one more thing in there. What is that when we do that? See, you're getting the pattern. I like it. All right. So, Agile ceremonies. Stand-up meetings, not for us. Iteration planning meetings, not for us. What's for us? What is?
The retros.
Nicely done. Yes, it is. Retrospectives, in the sense that we own everything that is wrong in the retrospective. Retrospectives, in my opinion, are the most valuable ceremony we have. The most important one. Because we could start from the worst possible process. Doesn't matter what our process looks like. We could start from a horrible development process. If we do our retrospectives right and continuously improve all the time, we will get to an efficient process. And we'll do it together. So it may even be the better way to go. Start with some garbage process and get better all the time. But the danger in that is that we absolutely have to take these things seriously. And it's very easy to, if the development team is doing reasonably well, it's very easy to make it into a joke or to not take it very, very seriously. And, there's nothing wrong with having fun in those meetings, absolutely. But we have to model the behavior that says that we are taking this seriously. And primarily what that means from a leadership perspective is that we will move mountains to make things happen that come out of these retrospectives. If the development team says they need something or that they would like to try an experiment to see if something helps improve their process, find a way to make that happen. That's what these things are for, and that's what it means to be a self-directed team. But there's also something else that's really important here, and that if something said in a retrospective were to come out in a status report or be escalated up to upper management, nobody's going to say anything in those retrospectives that's useful ever again. So it has to be a safe place to talk and say what people are thinking. So we have to keep it safe. I thought that drawing was awesome. I did not do that. So we're not going to breach the trust of our developers and do that. So, ceremonies. The development team to help themselves get better. Sounds familiar as well. So be careful how you use the planning meetings, how you use the stand-up meetings, and be very, very diligent when it comes to overcoming roadblocks. That includes both the things that come out of the retrospective and the things that come out of the daily stand-ups. Take those seriously. We're actually going pretty quickly here. So, was there a question? Or? All right.
I just thought of something.
Yes.
Demo ceremony is not on there.
Thoughts?
Just a thought. Observation.
What do you feel like a demo ceremony is? Who owns that and why?
In a way, it's the developer's moment to show off what they've done. In a way. I never liked them when it felt more like a status-y kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I worked somewhere where like you had to show something. I was like, well, here's a SQL query. I don't do anything visual, so like, what do you want to see, you know? And it was sort of bastardized and like not cool, but I think if done right, and you have something to show it.
Anybody else want to comment on that before I inject my stupidity?
It will depend on the attendees. If you're 2 levels of boss present, then you're automatically trying to impress some people. If it is just the group or multiple groups, but all below a certain level, then you can have more of a working group where you learn and share. You don't want to be seen learning in front of your boss's boss's boss. You want to seem confident.
And you want to be the expert there. That totally makes sense. The thing that we haven't mentioned in this yet is customers. Because I think the primary intent of the demo is that we're showing the customers that, yeah, A, we're accomplishing what they want us to accomplish, and it gives them the opportunity to say, you know what, that's not really what I had in mind.
The customers, like,
Well, and this, you know, who are primarily internal customers, so the stakeholders.
I don't think we've had any stakeholders at ours, have we?
Yeah, it's just
Not
engineering.
yet.
It's usually project by project. We'll show stakeholders.
I would say if you can't identify stakeholders that are end users who likely have a lot of input on your product, even if it's consumer facing, there are like advocates who work with those customers who might have a lot of insights that you could include.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like we would do better if we had more of the people who are actually using the product and seeing them earlier. But then again, we're also, as you know, as an agile team, we're also supposed to have the customers sitting with us, working with us as much as possible. So the ideal circumstance now, obviously everyone has a job to do, so you know, reality hits, but the ideal circumstance is that we are building side by side with the people who are actually going to use it. So if we're not going to do that, it seems like we almost have to have them involved in the demos. It's a good thought. So something that we should definitely think about. Maybe something that could come up in one of our retrospectives.
I think we do these like monthly status meetings. We have program meetings with just other product and engineering teams. And you have like stakeholder updates, which should be like every quarter or perhaps more frequently than that, team by team. But I think like the demo that I've seen every other Friday, right? That we have that every other Friday?
Yep.
Seems like to be strictly for engineering, from engineering to engineering, with engineering in mind. Like that is it.
And that makes some sense too. I mean, we want to communicate amongst our engineering teams too,
Mhm.
so.
Yeah, products should be giving regular kind of like demos to the stakeholders on a regular basis, because if you don't, then you're not in touch with them and that iterative process is broken. So
Yeah, we're building what we think we should be building rather than what they think we should be building.
exactly. And then you ship something out that they don't like.
Like, you built this one?
That never happens.
Yeah.
I did have one comment, just kind of interested in your thoughts on this. When you talked about the retro, you said you could start with the worst process in the world. Like, yeah, just throw it out there and we'll iterate and we will get better as a team. Why is that concept different than taking on technical debt, right? Like, I know that you also said sometimes it's appropriate to get out technical debt. When you talked about the retro, that was the first thing that came to my mind. Like, well, we know that this concept is going to deliver some impact for our customer, so let's just get it out there, even if it's not the most ideal thing in the world, and we'll iterate over time to make that better. I guess it seems like from this presentation, it's there would be a lot of hesitation around that because of the technical debt that it would create. But when we're talking about a retro, like that concept is kind of okay, right? So like, do you know what I'm?
I do, and I think there's so the agile way of doing things, right, is to create the simplest thing that could possibly work, show it to the customers, get it in front of them as quickly as possible, and then have them tell us where we're wrong or where we're right. But that doesn't mean that we build it in a way that is unsupportable, unmaintainable, et cetera. It's got to have all of the abilities that goes along with it. So the simplest thing that could possibly work is something that is still production worthy. Our process hopefully is also production worthy, but maybe not, you know?
Yeah, that helps.
So yeah, it's the same concept. I mean, I like the metaphor there. I like because it really is equivalent in some ways. If we have a bad development process, it is similar to taking on technical debt. So. All right, you want to talk about tools and technologies a little bit? So, what tools are not for development leadership?
Oh, no.
Yes, Taskboards. Not for you. Who benefits from having an electronic taskboard? Why do we need an electronic taskboard? What's wrong with just putting sticky notes up on the wall in the right places?
It's hard if you're working remote.
That's correct. That is the one thing that is benefit. But let me ask you something. Would it work just as effectively if we had that up on the board and then we had a semi-decent webcam that was pointing at it so anybody who was remote could see it, and then they just slack us when they need something moved the same as anybody else?
No, because there's all the stuff related to each story, acceptance criteria, user stories, all that kind of stuff. Are you saying like,
It's on the tab, it's on the card. Right?
okay, so if the card had user story, acceptance criteria, like what it's related
It's
to.
a placeholder for a conversation. It doesn't have to have 8 pages of stuff on it.
Right.
In fact, it probably shouldn't.
I'm not saying it's not. There's just a lot of good stuff there. Like when it's due and printed stuff.
I think we sometimes use that as a substitute for actual conversations. And I don't know that that's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I'll put my hard hat back on.
It's all good. Let's look at the purpose of a task board. The purpose is to identify what's been done, what needs to be done, and in some relative order, what should be done next. And then is there anything stuck? We kind of talked about that stuck a little earlier when we're doing the daily planning meeting. We're going to see if a card is stuck in the whip column for a long period of time. We can do all of this without having an electronic task board. The problem is electronic task boards tend to be something that leadership wants, because they can do reports and all kinds of interesting things with it. And those are important. I don't want to sound like I'm minimizing that, because that is important. But what do you want your developers doing? Where do you want them spending their time? Do you want them creating value for the customers, or do you want them doing things to help build status reports? Those same kind of reports can be built in other ways. Be creative, figure things out, look for automation. I'll tell you what, if your Taskboard, and I will say this to people at the conference, if your Taskboard does not integrate with your developer's primary tool set, throw it away. It has no use for the development team, at least from the developer's perspective. So figure out a way, if you need to integrate it, find a way to integrate it. If you need to hire an intern to do the data entry for it, do that. Don't create friction for your developers. Let them spend their time solving problems and creating value for the users. Because I'll tell you what, that, extra minute per task, whatever it is, that small amount of time per task adds up, and it adds up quickly, both in developer time and in developer frustration.
Wouldn't there be like some thought to like, well, if you know it's done and you tell me it's done, then I can move like the boards for you? Like, is there a part of it where you can take that work off of them and do
Sure.
it on their behalf?
I mean, we're already saying that in the stand-up meetings, right?
Yeah. Like, oh, I can move that if you want. They're like, oh, yeah, it's done. So it's like, okay.
I have seen, in fact, I've seen it here, even stand-up meetings where, oh, that one's done, okay, and somebody has a machine and they're moving the card right as it happens in real time. I think that's very highly appropriate.
I think one thing that it might help to explain a bit more of, because I would say a lot of the APMs and probably even PMs in the room have never seen it, but what kind of systems do integrate with developer tools? What have you seen in the past, and why is that a benefit? Because what we have today really doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't at all. So probably the easiest one to talk to is GitHub. Github Tools, there's the same kind of taskboard and tasks as what we have in Jira. But the only thing the developers have to do is they have to include in their Git check-in comments, which they're already doing Git check-ins. So you just include in the check-in comment closes issue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or there's a couple of other ones that I rarely use, but I'm sure some of the Git experts in the room could help. But developers are already involved in it. They're already doing that anyways. So just adding in a comment that says that closes this issue, almost no impedance to doing that. And we could even do it. We could even take another step if we chose to. We could make a CLI that runs right next to Git. A CLI is command line interface. So Git, there's usually a command, git commit -m and put your comment in there. We could also do the same thing where all I have to do is hit up arrow in my terminal, so it says git commit, and I change that to Jira commit. I change it from Git to Jira and hit enter, and it updates the proper thing there. We can build those kind of tools if we're willing to commit a little bit of time to it.
I will say that I think, and maybe you're already kind of going down this path, but like the task boards may not be for leadership, but I do think there's value in different development teams all using the same system, because if they're not, to me, it seems like development teams would start to get siloed. Like if we have one team that's like, oh, I really want to use like Post-it notes on a wall for managing tasks and progress. And another team says, awesome, I want to use Jira to do it on my side. And another team's like, I'm going to use Git to track the tickets that we're completing. What happens when we have a cross-functional project that involves teams from different parts of the business? Like how do we understand what's going on across those different systems? So I think there's some value in like the universal.
I really don't see that from a developer perspective. That may be the case from a leadership perspective. That's not something I've experienced. I mean, developers are all polyglots to a large degree anyways, right? Every one of us knows, you know, HTML and, you know, another language and Git and all kinds of other tools. So, you know, moving from one team now, as long if it were inconsistent within the single team, so I have to stay, you know, I'm in this one team and today we're using this, but tomorrow we're using this and some other, that would be annoying. But if I switch over to another team, or if I'm working with another team on that day and they use a different system, I would be interested in hearing other developers' perspectives on that, but I don't think that would be a problem for most.
I think it just has to do with the team feeling autonomous. The teams need to be able to choose the tools that they need to get their work done. And if someone at a higher level needs to perform some cross functionality, that's a different problem they should be solving. They shouldn't be necessarily leaning on the engineering team's tools to do that.
And I think if you view each user story as a conversation, like if I'm waiting on a ticket from core and I get an update and that tells me that their stuff is done and it unblocks my work, like that really, like whether they had it on a sticky note and they communicated it out that way, or whether they had it on a ticket or a Git or whatever, like it just begins a conversation like, what did you accomplish? What do you need from us? Okay, you're unblocked, we can go and kind of take it from there. So I think I've been pondering that you're using stories instead of having to talk to people, and I can agree that yes, there are times when it's like, well, it's all in the ticket, so like, what do you want from me? But I think it should be a conversation. You'll get probably better outcomes that way, no matter what.
I guess the big concern is information overload. We need to be able to filter information to just the information we need, right? Because otherwise, I mean, we could throw every commit into Slack and nobody would ever look at the Slack, right? Right? So the fact that, okay, I know you're blocked on this. So because of that, when I do the work that I know unblocks you, I'm going to come over and talk to you, or I'm going to send you a specific Slack message. I think that's a lot more valuable than just creating a lot of signal that nobody's going to listen to.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So we won't breach that trust. All right. So another thing that is not for us is prototypes and research spikes. We have another award to give out here, which we'll do in a second, right after we talk about Ward Cunningham. Ward Cunningham is one of the signers of the Agile Manifesto. And he says that a spike is the simplest thing we can program that will convince us we're on the right track. A spike being a story used to reduce or eliminate unknowns. So whenever we have unknowns, and I talked a little bit about this earlier, what we should be doing is we should be spiking it. And a spike can be just research, it can be a prototype, it can be quite a number of things designed to figure out, not only answer questions of things that we don't know, but also figure out what we don't know. And that may even be more important. So as a result, I consider prototypes and spikes to be our most underutilized tool, because I don't feel like any development team I've ever been on has really made effective use or has made enough use of these tools. We should be doing this whenever there is any reasonable level of unknown in a story. Now, I don't mean that's like, well, I don't know how to put a comma in that place, so I'm, you know, it has to be some reasonable level of unknown. But I think it's really important that we do more of these and find out. I mean, there's going to be some looking at it in the retrospective and say, all right, was it worth it? Was it helpful to do that spike? And then we can learn from that. But there's also one important thing that we need to make sure we understand about prototypes and research spikes, and that is the result of them is knowledge. That's the artifact that comes out of a spike. The only thing you're going to get out of it is a better understanding of the tools you're using, or of the technology that's involved, or the process that you need to follow. Knowledge. If you try to make it more than that, now that being said, we need to track that knowledge, right? We need to not lose that. So it's good to put it somewhere, maybe in a JIRA ticket, if that is what makes you happy. We do need to track that. That can often result in something, some code that's checked into Git, and maybe we even have the opportunity to copy and paste some of that code into our final production action or production artifacts. But we don't want to ever turn any of this directly into production. I suggest to you that it takes just as long to productionize something that was built as a spike or as a prototype as it does to build it from scratch. And building it from scratch is always going to be better. You're always going to do better the second time around. Anybody ever done just as poorly the second time as doing something the first time?
Bowling, I get worse. Yeah.
Well, that's because you're not drinking enough.
I bowl a strike the first frame every time it goes downhill.
I always get better because I drink more.
Does that apply to coding as well?
Mhm.
Okay.
Have you ever seen, look up the Balmer curve?
I've seen that.
Okay. All right. There was one other thing I wanted to say about that. I mentioned Ward Cunningham and saying it's the simplest thing we can code to tell us we're on the right track. That means we're not doing all the things we discussed earlier, putting in all the maintainability tool, maintainability, extensibility, et cetera. We're not putting all that in there. So if we were to try and take that and put that into production, that's the worst thing we can possibly do, because nobody is going to build it quickly again the next time, right? If we say, we just need you to do something quick, and then, yep, we took it and we put it in production. They're not going to build it quick the next time. They're going to build it knowing that they have to support it later. They're going to put it in, they're going to build it right instead of quick so that we can learn from it. And of course, that would be the breach of trust that we would have in that scenario. So, task boards, not for us. Prototypes and spikes, not for us as development team leadership. What is for us? And here's where we wrap the whole thing up in one big bow, right? Trust. Trust is ours to build or to destroy. Have any of you read Simon Sinek's Leaders Eat Last? If you haven't, please read it. It's a short read, it's easy, it's really good. Or if you're more comfortable watching video, his TED Talk on why good leaders make you feel safe is a great watch. Really, really well done. I didn't really intend, when I started building this talk, I didn't intend it to be how to implement his ideas in development teams, but I'm kind of cool with the fact that it worked out that way. If we can create trust and safety in our development teams, and what I mean by that is everybody on the team knows that everybody else has their back. If we can create that team, that is going to be the most efficient, most powerful team we've ever worked on. So let's spend the last few minutes here talking about some things that can make or break trust, as if we haven't been doing that already. Estimates are always lies. I didn't see any reaction there. I kind of expected a little bit of, but wait a second.
I'm just laugh crying on the inside.
Is that what you're doing?
Yes.
Okay. So the typical response to that is, but wait, it's not a lie if I'm asking them to estimate, if I'm asking them to just take a guess. And it's not a lie if I'm not going to hold them to it, and I tell them I'm not going to hold them to it, and I actually don't. And my answer to that is yes, and. That is technically true from a linguistic perspective. It is technically not a lie. But think about it from a human perspective. When you've asked somebody to put a number on something, to put a time on it, or put an order of magnitude even on it, what you've asked them for is their expertise. Look into the future and tell me, using your expertise, how long this will take. And nobody wants to lie to you. Everyone wants to be that expert. So what you've told them, even though you can say all you want, I'm not going to hold you to it. It's just a guess. Give me your best guess. They still feel like you've made them lie to you. Now, estimates are generally not something we try to do in an Agile environment. They do have to happen occasionally, They tend to happen more along the lines of, do you think you can fit this in? It's tough.
So what do you ask for instead?
Why do you have to ask for anything?
Stakeholders.
Knowing,
What do the stakeholders want to know?
Well, sorry.
go ahead, no, you know the answer.
I
I know you guys are clearly, because I know you're going where I expect you to go.
So I feel like, and maybe it's the expectations that we're setting for the stakeholders, but I feel like because we do quarterly planning, like the way that we present our work to stakeholders, they're expecting a certain body of work to be done within that quarter. And then when we structure our meetings with them to have a weekly update or a bi-weekly thing that we send out, their natural question, you know, if you say, this is what we committed to in the quarterly planning, or this is what we committed to get done in this sprint, and it's not done, their natural follow-up question is, well, why? Like you said, it would be done. When can I expect it? And then if they're, and then you're like stuck in that loop. And then if they are in turn have people that they're controlling, like for us, it's in sale, and they're working with 500 advocates who they're trying to determine like how much they need to staff. They need to make estimates for the future. They need to plan out, like, we need some ramp time to change our policies, or we need some ramp time to train these advocates. Yeah, that's where that's coming from.
And you also said that short-term planning is detrimental to the company. How am I supposed to do long-term planning if I don't even know what today looks like?
Well, let me tell you a story.
All right. Oh, no. I should go.
So I was in a meeting one time with Brad Jensen. Brad Jensen was for a while the CIO of US Airways, which eventually became American Airlines, and then he was no longer the CIO. Maybe that has something to do with this story, maybe not. I don't know. He was talking about a time when he was a program manager at Sabre Systems. So if you're familiar with Sabre Systems, they're a huge company, mainframe mostly, and they do most of the reservation systems for all the airlines, all the major airlines in the world, pretty much. If your reservation was, the only one that I know of that doesn't use them is Southwest. Everybody else uses Sabre. What he used to say when, you know, he told us a story about when his customers came to him. He's a program manager, and his customers are coming to him and say, well, when are you going to be done with this? His answer was always the same. When you tell me I'm done. Not usually, we've never been closer, because that's what I usually say. But no, when you tell me I'm done, when you tell me I'm done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you value every week. And I'm going to tell you roughly how much value I think I can give you every week. We're going to negotiate that. I'm going to work on that. I'm going to try and get the developers. We're going to talk to the developers and see what they can accomplish for us in that week. But it all comes down to trust. If you trust us to get as much done as we can.
We trust you.
Right.
It's not, it's stakeholders do not, I think. Well, I guess I'm just speaking from.
No, I agree with you 100%. That's the problem, is they don't trust us. Now, maybe we've given them no reason to trust us. Maybe they're constantly changing, and so, you know, they don't know that they need to trust us. But I think we can earn that trust. If we're constantly delivering at a high level over a long period of time, why wouldn't they trust us? And so why do they need me to tell them I'm going to be done on this date? Now, yes, there are coordination tasks that need to happen. And part of that, I suspect, is because we're not working closely enough together. We need to put the training materials together to be able to do the work with the advocates that are going to deal, you know, that are going to be using this feature. Why aren't those people sitting with us as we build these things? They could be working on their laptops, building the same things that, you know, building the tools that they're going to need to, you know, the training materials. But I think it's that lack of coordination, that lack of working together that is really causing the lack of trust and the need for us to predict the future and say, oh, we can do better. not probably overnight. I realize we can't, just say, trust me and have everyone expect it, that's not going to happen. There's a reality and we have to work towards that. But the goal should be, we don't do estimates at all.
So is the better answer like, we're doing everything we can, we're delivering value every week, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm.
It'll happen once other things start becoming more important than this thing. Like,
Well,
for example, like you have a big long project you're trying to do, like the plan of the project because this needed to go out and you said that this needed to go out and this interrupted and this got in the way and this got in the way. So it's like, we wanted all these, we did all these, like.
Well, and the
Right.
big win for them is going to come when they say, when they do exactly that. They say, you know what, we said we needed this by the, this was the next highest priority, but it turns out that we could get some, dollar value benefit if we actually do this first. And us being able to turn on a dime like that and do that, which is one of the things that we get out of the Agile methodologies, that's a big win for them. Another thing is just keep inviting them over to work with us. I mean, you want to see what we're doing and how we're accomplishing it, sit down and work with one of us, just as we do with them when we're trying to learn, when we do the ride-alongs with them. Have them come and work. All right, we're working on something that you're interested in. Come sit with us and work on it. That'll improve our process too. So we try and avoid estimates whenever we can, because they're always lies.
One thing to note too, Liz and Masha, that might be helpful for you guys, is I believe the intention as we move into HQ5 is to sit the engineering and product teams much closer to the business than we do today.
Yes, that would be awesome.
Yes, all nearby holding hands.
They're calling it bringing the gang back together because that's how Carvana started, was this really close relationship between advocates and our business users and engineering and product. We all sat in one small area and there was a lot of opportunities for interaction and we were able to move a lot faster.
It's so wholesome. I'm so excited.
I am looking forward to that as well. I think that's going to be awesome.
Friends everywhere.
All right, what else we got? We got a couple more here. Deadlines. They're very much like estimates in a lot of ways, right? Love the sound they make as they fly by. I had a manager one time who, this was before Agile was big, so it was right around the, what is that, the turn of the century or the turn of the millennium? What is it?
Turn of the century 2000.
Yes. That is what it is, right?
I guess. Just makes me feel
It was right around then. So it was about 20 years ago now. All right, let me say it that way. About 20 years ago. I had this manager who decided, yeah, I know.
I was watching Masha reflect on that one.
He decided, I don't know whether he'd like read a magazine article or a textbook or something, or if he just learned this in school, but he decided that people needed to be challenged. And so he had to set deadlines that challenged us. And yeah, I know. And so he would make these deadlines that were tight and he would challenge us to make, I need you guys to make this deadline. I just mean, make this deadline. And he did that a couple of times and we beat ourselves up to try and meet his deadlines. And then we found out that that's what he was doing, that his deadlines weren't real. And how much caring about his deadlines did we have after that? Deadlines have to be real, but they also have to be responsible and reasonable when we have to do them. Part of, I think, being responsible is not using them when we don't need to. Now, with Agile, we try to avoid deadlines other than the end of the sprint. All right, the end of the sprint is usually sort of a deadline, but it's a fixed point in time that we've agreed to, and we've said, here's the work. We as developers, I shouldn't say it that way. I have to train myself not to say it that way. That the development team has said, we think we can do this work in this time. An example of one that really couldn't be avoided is the code freeze that Carvana is in right now. That ultimately creates a deadline because it says if you want code in place by Black Friday, you have to have it done by this date. So there are legitimate uses of deadlines, but they should be avoided whenever possible. And then of course, always reasonable and responsible. All right, one last thing. Self-directed teams. I mentioned this earlier. Self-directed teams are what we should all be striving for, right? And they absolutely have authority over themselves. They need to be able to decide what tools they use, what technologies they use, even to the point of programming language if necessary. Now, there is some value in standards. And I think we, especially here at Carvana, we do a pretty good job of balancing that, doing that balancing act between having standards and letting development teams do what they need to do and work in the technologies that suit them best. But we can always be better. Everyone can always be better at it. And if a development team in their retrospective says, we feel like we need to do this, like I said before, we need to move mountains to try and find ways to make that happen. Because they're not going to ask you for things that you can't deliver unless they're really important.
What about like sprints versus scrums? Like sprint versus, I'm sorry,
Sort of like Kanban?
Kanban versus sprint. Like it's like, we prefer this over this. Like at some point, is it just like, could we use one on one team and another on another team? Or what do you mean self-directed, like as a cluster unit, or as like some people doing small things?
Well, you know, who's doing the retrospective, right? So whoever's doing a retrospective, they're retrospecting on their process and their experience in the previous iteration, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're trying to solve a problem. And whatever problem they're trying to solve, if they feel like the solution to that problem is go to Kanban or go to Scrum or go to XP or do more pairing or do less pairing or whatever it is they feel like it is,
Mm-hmm.
as long as they can say, here's why we think we're doing it, here's why, you know, what problem we're trying to solve, why shouldn't they do it? Because remember, keep in mind the goals, right? Increasing user value, maximizing the value we can deliver to the users while minimizing the total cost of ownership. So we're out of time here, so I'm going to deliver to you my call to action. We go back to our development teams. I challenge you to use the retrospectives. This is your one takeaway here. Use the retrospectives to create an environment of trust. Eliminate anything from our development process that isn't about increasing the value to the users and decreasing the total cost of ownership, or it doesn't lead to that. I think I need to say that better. Everything we do should be about increasing total cost or increasing value to the users and increasing total cost of ownership. That is what all our Agile ceremonies and metrics and tools are about. Finding problems early so that we can deliver that value as quickly as possible with as low a total cost of ownership as possible. So use those retrospectives and create that environment of trust as much as you can. Everybody has everybody else's back. Here's the slide deck. You can find it at devteamdreams.azurewebsites.net. That will redirect you to the latest version of it. So if you want to bookmark this and you bookmark that URL, it will always redirect you to the latest version of this slide deck. If you want the current version of it, bookmark what it redirects you to, and you will always get the version that you just saw.
Nice.
Cool. Well, thank you for attention. And if you have any comments or any improvement areas or anything I missed, please let me know. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you.
Absolutely.